Hello, my name is Mitya, and in this tutorial we'll go through 3D scenes and how to render 3D particles in Lightact. So as we mentioned before, there are three types of layers: layer, 2D scene, and 3D scene. Layer is for rendering things to canvas, basically, for movie playback, simple textures, images, and so on. 2D scene is for real-time rendering of 2D textures in 2D space, and 3D scene basically creates a 3D space where it's mostly used for 3D particle systems. So let's create a 3D scene, and we'll also create a standard layer. You'll see why in a bit. So when you double click a 3D scene, you see a window that is similar to 2D scenes. You've got an additional space at the top where you see basically what you've created. But before we can see anything here, the first thing is to create a perspective camera. Okay, and let's connect it like so. The next thing that you need to do is you need to select which camera you'd want to render. So at the moment we just have one, so we'll create that one. And now you see that we have a 3D space here. We've got a grid that's helping us to understand what's happening, and so on. So let's first use this texture that we create here and import it into a regular layer so we can render it to a canvas and then on to video screens, slides, projectors, and so on. We start by creating a new texture variable, and let's rename it into something more telling. Okay. And when you create a new variable, you need to select the camera and tell the camera to which parent variable it should render to. So we select the variable we created. Great. Let's close this layer for now and open the regular layer. And now what we're going to do, we're going to grab this variable and render it to the canvas. So now you see that we have just the grid. We haven't created anything yet. Okay, let's leave this open for now so we can walk to something else. In the view menu here, you can decide whether you want to render grid or not. Now you don't see the grid, and you also don't see it here. Or if you want to render helper objects, which is something that we'll encounter in a bit. Okay, so the next thing that you need to do if you want to render something is, of course, to create a render 3D node. Similarly to render 2D node, it has a couple of buttons, and in most cases you'll want to use add new system input. You can create several of them, where the system refers to the particle system. And this is the one you should use. If you see this one, this is something that's been introduced in previous versions of Lightact, and it's going to be probably removed in the future ones. So let's create a particle system and connect it straight away to our render 3D node. Before we continue, you can have several render 3D nodes connected in sequence or whatever you want. You can have several particle systems and so on. So it's all really flexible. Okay, when you select the node, you see a couple of modules on the right hand side. Now, if you click on the plus button here, you can, for example, create new modules, and you can enable or disable them, or you can remove them. These are the default modules, and you cannot disable or remove them. So let's go through them. First, you've got the max particles number. This tells the system how many particles, the maximum number of allowed particles at the same time. So we'll increase that to something a bit more and click on reset. Great. The particle emitter, it tells the system what kind of an emitter we have. There are a couple of them. Point emitter emits all the particles from the same point. Sphere emits them from a sphere, and cylinder from a cylinder, whereas the texture basically emits them from a texture, and we'll talk about these later on. Okay, So in order to activate this particle system, we need to connect a helper object of the correct type to the particle system. So in order to expose the pins here, you simply click on this icon. So you can have many different inputs, and you should select these. You should enable the pins for these properties in case you want to make them dynamic, so they change in time. This is something that you basically have to select. So in order to activate the particle system. So here we're going to create a helper point and connect it like so. And now you see that the particle system started emitting. Okay, let's first increase the spawn rate a bit. And let's, in the particle property, increase the lifetime to 10. Now it helps if you click on reset in case you change these things. So now you see that we've got plenty of new particles. Okay, so if, for example, if I move this, you see that the origin point moves of the point and so on. Okay, let's, for the purpose of this tutorial, create something a tad more exciting, and let's change the emitter type to sphere. Now, because we don't have the correct helper type connected to the helper object pin, we need to delete that, and we can delete that as well and insert a helper sphere instead. Great, like so. Now you see that the particles are emitted from a sphere. There are a couple of options here. One is to select on surface, for example, and now all of the particles will start on the surface. And the other one is to inherit direction, which is here, this one. Okay, let's disable that. Properties in the particle section are pretty self-explanatory. The initial color determines the color the particles start with. The initial size determines the size of the particles start with. Here, for example, is the minimum velocity and maximum velocity. So the velocity that is being assigned to each particle is somewhere in between these two, for example, and these two in Y direction and these two in Z direction. So if you, for example, do this, then you'll see that the particles have bigger velocities in the X direction. So let's change this back. And in the material section, you can change the texture of for example, of the particle. Now at the moment we have just a simple blob texture that's default, but if you enable the pin and connect whatever you want to it, we should make sure that we don't use too big textures that are just too big for us. So if we connect here, you see that you have very small Perlin noise textures assigned to it. And for example, you can use textures that are color changing. So here, if I enable the preview here, you see that the color of this is changing. So what's happening is that the initial color is being multiplied by this the texture that's coming in. But let's remove this for now. So now we have the basic blob texture. Okay, so let's add some more things. If you click plus, you have several modifiers. You have acceleration. So for example, if you enable it, let's increase this. If you enable it, then the particles will accelerate in whichever direction they're moving. let's disable that. And if you create a gravity and enable it or increase that a bit, you see that the particles will fall down or up depending how you want. It's basically another form of acceleration, but just makes it easier if you want to move it this way. Damping is opposite of acceleration. So what it does is it stops the movement of particles after a certain time. So if we increase the velocity, you see that they are stopping at a certain time, after a certain time, depending on the value of your damping. Okay, let's disable that, or maybe enable it for just a very small amount. Okay, we've done the size. Now you have two over life properties, modifiers. One is size over life and the other one is color over life. So let's use the size over life, and if we expand it, you see that this is how the size will change if you enable it, of course, over life. But let's disable damping so we'll see a bit more. So the max size, so this is this point here. So the particles now will start with size 500, and then over life, depending what's the lifetime of your particle, their size will decrease down to 1, or maybe we can say 100. Okay. The next one is color over life, which is similar in that it basically assigns the value of each channel through the life. So here, for example, through lifetime of a particle. So here, for example, you see that the red channel in the beginning is set to 500 to 255, so that means full. And whereas the green is always the same, and let's maybe decrease it just at the end a bit, like so, or even more, like so. So now you see that just before the particles die out, their color turns more to the blue, but let's make it even more so. And increase the blue. Oh, that's why. Let's actually leave it like this and put it up like that. Okay. Great. Now, the next one that we might want to talk about is the noise modifier. So this one, for example, is something that creates a more lifelike movement. I don't like this so much. Let's move this a bit up, like so. So fractal Brownian motion adds almost like a turbulence effect, so it looks more natural. And curl noise is in a way something similar that you might want to play with. What you also might want to play with is the cylinder is obviously very similar to sphere, and we are going to talk about texture emitter in the next tutorial. Okay, so now we can go back to the to our render to canvas, and we see that we still have the grid here. What we might want to do is move this a bit closer. Let's move it like so. So we are a bit closer, and what we'll want to do is disable render grid. By the way, if you connect, you might want to see how big your helper sphere is. So in that way, you can create a new element input and insert a connected to helper sphere. So now you see where your particles are being spawned. So you can leave this as it is, but if you disable that, then they won't be rendered. So now if we go to our layer and maybe create a canvas and connect it like so, you see that we have our particles rendered in the canvas.